The ceiling fans hummed lazily above the smoky conference room inside the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service headquarters. Maps of the Pacific covered the walls, lines of red and blue pins stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Around the long table sat Japan's senior air officers, their crisp uniforms marked with ribbons and gold braid. General Hajime Sugiyama, the chief of the Army General Staff, leaned back in his chair as one of his aides read aloud a newly intercepted intelligence report. It spoke of an American bomber, massive, 4 engines, a Superfortress, they called it. It could fly higher than any fighter in the world. It could carry more bombs than anything ever built before. And they claimed it could strike Japan itself from bases thousands of miles away. The officers exchanged glances. A chuckle escaped one of them. "A plane that can fly to Tokyo and back from India?" Colonel Tanaka scoffed. "Nonsense. American propaganda. Their factories dream too big," Sugiyama smirked. "Even if it were true, the war will be over long before they build such a thing." The room filled with polite laughter. Cigarette smoke curled upward as the conversation drifted back to the war in China, the defense of the Philippines, the Pacific Islands still burning under the rising sun flag, but one officer remained silent. Major Yoshida, a quiet man with sharp eyes and a career built on careful analysis, sat at the far end of the table. He had read the same intelligence reports, but unlike his colleagues, he had also studied American industrial capacity. He had seen the photographs of Detroit's automobile factories converted to tank production. He had read about the Kaiser shipyards launching a new Liberty ship every single day. After the meeting, as officers filed out into the humid Tokyo evening, Yoshida approached General Sugiyama. "Sir, permission to speak candidly?" Sugiyama, lighting a cigarette, nodded. "You always do, Yoshida. What troubles you?" "The Americans. Their industrial capability is unprecedented in history. If they say they can build such a bomber, perhaps we should consider the possibility that they will." Sugiyama's smile faded slightly. "You worry too much, Major. Japan's spirit cannot be bombed. Our people will endure anything." He paused, looking out at the glittering city lights stretching toward the horizon. "Besides, Tokyo is beyond their reach." "It always has been. It always will be." Yoshida bowed respectfully, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake a cold feeling in his chest. He had learned, through bitter experience in China, never to underestimate an enemy's determination. Outside, Tokyo's summer air shimmered with heat. The city was alive, confident, untouchable. Few in that room imagined that, less than 2 years later, those same streets would glow red beneath a storm of fire. Seattle. Washington, September 1940. 3 years before that Tokyo meeting. In a cramped office overlooking Puget Sound, a Boeing engineer named George Scherer hunched over technical drawings that would change the world. Rain streaked the windows as he and his team worked through their 3rd consecutive night. The challenge before them was seemingly impossible. Design a bomber that could fly 5,000 miles carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs at 400 miles per hour, at altitudes above 30,000 feet. The Army Air Corps had given them specifications that pushed beyond every known limit of aviation technology. "It can't be done," muttered Frank Jensen, Boeing's chief aerodynamics engineer, staring at the calculations. "The engines don't exist. The materials aren't strong enough. The fuel consumption alone, then we'll invent them," Scherer interrupted, his eyes bloodshot but burning with intensity. "The Army knows what's coming. Hitler's conquered Europe. Japan's rampaging through China. When America enters this war, and we'll need a bomber that can reach anywhere in the world." They called it the Model 345. The military would call it the B-29 Superfortress, but between concept and reality lay a chasm that would cost billions of dollars, years of labor, and the lives of test pilots who would push untested machines to their limits. Wichita, Kansas, December 1943. Thousands of miles away in the frozen heart of America, the first Boeing B-29 Superfortress rolled out of the hangar under floodlights. Workers cheered as its massive silver wings caught the light. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. A 99-foot-long giant with a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and engines that could push it higher than 30,000 feet. But those cheers masked a deeper truth. The B-29 was still barely functional. Eddie Sanchez, a young crew chief from Texas, stood beside the aircraft with his team of mechanics. While photographers snapped pictures and executives gave speeches, Eddie's eyes traced the maze of hydraulic lines, electrical systems, and those troublesome Wright R3350 engines, beasts that generated 2,200 horsepower each but overheated so badly they'd been nicknamed wrong R3350s. By the crews, she's beautiful, whispered Jimmy Chen, Eddie's assistant mechanic, a second-generation Chinese-American whose family had fled to the United States just before Pearl Harbor. She's a widowmaker, Eddie replied grimly. Count the days before one of these engines catches fire mid-flight. He wasn't wrong. In February 1943, test pilot Eddie Allen had died when his B-29's engine burst into flames over Seattle, the plane crashing into a meatpacking plant and killing 11 workers on the ground. 18 people dead in a single accident, and the program had nearly been canceled. Engineers still battled mechanical gremlins. The Wright R3350 engines overheated. The wiring failed in the cold. Fuel pumps seized. Hydraulic systems leaked. The remote gun turrets jammed. But the Americans were desperate. They needed a bomber that could reach Japan, and only the B-29 could do it. At airfields in India and China, ground crews cursed as they tried to keep the new planes running. Parts failed. Pilots aborted missions. Entire squadrons sat grounded while mechanics cannibalized one aircraft to keep 3 others flying. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, grew increasingly frustrated. He had promised President Roosevelt that American bombers would strike Japan by 1944. He had staked his reputation and billions of dollars on the B-29. Now, with the program plagued by delays and disasters, newspaper editors were calling it Arnold's folly, and the Japanese intelligence reports that reached Tokyo reinforced their belief. The Superfortress was a failure. By mid-1944, General Hideki Tojo himself dismissed the threat. The B-29, he told his cabinet, is too large, too slow, and too fragile to matter. Let the Americans waste their resources, but quietly, the Americans had a new plan, a way to use the B-29's flaws as strengths. Part 2. Islands of Fire Saipan. June 1944. The battle for Saipan had been a slaughter. For 3 weeks, American Marines fought through sugarcane fields and volcanic caves against Japanese defenders who refused to surrender. Nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers died. 3,000 civilians, convinced by their own propaganda that Americans would torture and murder them, leaped from the cliffs at Marpy Point rather than face capture. But for the American command, Saipan's value wasn't in its strategic position alone. It was in its location, 1,500 miles from Tokyo, close enough for the B-29s to reach Japan and return. By January 1945, the island had been transformed. Bulldozers carved airstrips from the jungle. Quonset huts sprouted like mushrooms across the landscape. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, and maintenance hangars stretched for miles. And on the flight line at Isley Field, hundreds of superfortresses gleamed under the tropical sun. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, a tail gunner from Ohio, sat on an ammunition crate watching yet another B-29 lumber down the runway. He was 20 years old and looked 30. 3 months in the Pacific had aged him beyond his years. "You think we'll make it back this time?" asked Private Danny Costa, a nervous 19-year-old radio operator on his first posting. Mitchell didn't answer immediately. He'd flown 7 missions over Japan already. 7 times he'd climbed into a freezing aircraft at 30,000 feet, watched Japanese fighters swarm like angry hornets, felt the plane shudder from flak explosions close enough to smell the cordite. 3 times his aircraft had limped home with dead engines and wounded crew. "Sure, kid," Mitchell finally said. "We'll make it." He didn't mention the empty bunks in their barracks, the crews that hadn't made it back. Didn't mention Bobby Hernandez, whose B-29 had exploded over Osaka when a fighter crashed into it. Didn't mention the nightmares that woke him every night, sweating and gasping. The new year dawned over a landscape of twisted metal and coral airstrips. The Mariana Islands were now in American hands. From here, the B-29s could finally reach Tokyo. Mechanics swarmed around them, loading bomb racks and checking engines. Young crews in olive-drab uniforms climbed aboard, men barely out of high school. Now flying the most advanced aircraft in the world, Major General Curtis LeMay, the 38-year-old commander of the Echte-One Bomber Command, watched from a jeep as another wave of B-29s thundered down the runway. He was not a man of speeches. He believed in results. And so far the results had been poor. Curtis LeMay's headquarters, Guam, March 1945. Curtis LeMay was not a man who enjoyed being wrong. Yet after 4 months of high-altitude precision bombing against Japan, he had to face an uncomfortable truth. His strategy was failing spectacularly. The problems were numerous and interlocking. At 30,000 feet, the newly discovered jet streams, rivers of 200-mile-per-hour winds in the upper atmosphere, scattered bombs miles from their targets. Clouds obscured objective.
The cold at altitude froze equipment and numbed crews. And Japanese cities, unlike German ones, weren't built around concentrated industrial complexes, but scattered small workshops throughout residential areas. They'd lost 50 bombers and barely scratched Japan's war production. LeMay chain-smoked cigars as he studied reconnaissance photographs of Tokyo. The city sprawled across the images like a vast maze, wooden houses packed together, narrow streets, almost no open spaces. 90% of the structures were made of wood, bamboo, and paper. "Gentlemen," he said to his assembled staff officers one evening in early March, "we're doing this wrong." The room fell silent. Major Thomas Power, his operations officer, exchanged glances with Colonel Samuel Anderson. They'd seen LeMay make radical decisions before. He was famous for it. But the intensity in his voice now was different. "High-altitude precision bombing isn't working," LeMay continued. "The jet stream, the weather, the dispersed targets, we're wasting bombs and getting men killed for nothing." He stubbed up his cigar and lit another. "So we're going to change tactics entirely." He laid out his plan. Strip the bombers of most of their defensive guns to save weight and carry more bombs. Lower their altitude to just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, into the range of flak and fighters, but below the worst of the weather. Fly at night to reduce fighter interception. And most radically, replace the usual high-explosive bombs with something new. M69 incendiary bomblets. The M69 was a simple but devastating weapon, a 19-inch cylinder weighing 6 pounds filled with jellied gasoline, napalm. Packed in clusters of 38, they would scatter over wide areas, each one bursting on impact to spray sticky fire that clung to wood, cloth, and human flesh. The room erupted in protests. "You're sending them in at 5,000 feet without guns?" Colonel Anderson said, his voice rising. "That's suicide." "The Japanese night fighter force is limited," LeMay replied calmly. "Our intelligence shows most of their interceptors aren't equipped for night operations, and their anti-aircraft guns have trouble with low, fast-moving targets at night." "And if you're wrong?" Power asked. LeMay met his gaze steadily. "Then I'll be relieved of command and court-martialed. But the war will still need to be won, and this is how we'll do it." Major Harold Bowman, an intelligence officer who had studied Japanese urban construction, spoke up. "Sir, if you're asking what I think you're asking, Tokyo's downtown districts are essentially kindling. Those houses are separated by maybe 3 feet at most. One good fire could what, Major?" Bowman swallowed. "Could burn down the entire city, sir. We're talking about a firestorm, like Hamburg or Dresden, but bigger, much bigger." The room went quiet again. Everyone there knew about the Allied bombing of Hamburg in July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, they had called it. The firestorm there had killed 40,000 people in a single night. Dresden, just weeks earlier, in February 1945, had killed 25,000. Those raids had been controversial, condemned by some as war crimes.
Captain Masao Endo's training and experience meant nothing that night. His 6 pumps, 40 volunteers, and careful protocols were overwhelmed within the first 20 minutes. The fire spread faster than human beings could react. By the time his crews reached one blaze, 3 more had erupted behind them. The narrow streets became impassable. Telephone lines melted and fell, cutting communication. Water mains burst from the heat, leaving pumps sucking at empty pipes. "Fall back," Endo shouted to his men, his voice raw from smoke inhalation. "Get to the river." But half his crew was already missing, lost in the smoke and chaos, possibly dead, possibly fled. The ones who remained looked at him with terrified eyes, waiting for orders that would save their lives. "Go," he screamed. "Don't stop for anything." They ran. Endo stayed behind for just a moment, looking back at the neighborhood he'd protected for 12 years. Every street, every house, every family, he knew them all. Mrs. Hayashi, who baked sweet bean cakes for the fire station every New Year. Young Kenji, who wanted to be a fireman when he grew up. The Tanaka widow and her daughter, who always waved when the trucks passed. All of it was burning. He turned and ran after his men, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. Up above, the B-29 crews could see it all. From 5,000 feet, the city looked like a glowing wound, pulsing red and orange against the Black Sea. The pilots felt the turbulence of rising heat buffet their planes, firestorms powerful enough to lift bombers hundreds of feet higher into the sky. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, in his tail gunner position, stared down at the inferno. He'd thought he understood what war meant. He'd seen Pearl Harbor newsreels, watched propaganda films about Japanese atrocities. But this was something else. From his position, he could see individual streets burning, could see tiny figures running through the flames, could imagine, though he tried not to, the screaming, the terror, the death happening below him while he sat in his electrically heated flight suit, relatively safe, watching it happen. "Tokyo's burning," he whispered into his intercom, his voice hollow. Captain Phillips heard him, but didn't respond. What could he say? That it was necessary? That it would save lives in the long run? Those were true things, possibly, but they felt obscene to speak aloud while watching human beings burn by the thousands. So he said nothing, just flew the course home, hands steady on the controls, while behind him the capital of Japan turned to ash. The navigator, Sergeant Tom Blackwell, wrote in his log, could see the fire from 150 miles away. He didn't write what he was thinking, that some things, once seen, can never be unseen. Tokyo, 4 a.m. By 4 in the morning, the last B-29s had departed. The firestorm raged on without them. Kimiko Tanaka lay unconscious in a charred doorway, her clothes burned away, her skin blistered and blackened. She had searched for Yuki until her strength gave out, screaming her daughter's name until her voice broke, pushing through crowds and flames until her body simply stopped obeying her commands. A rescue worker found her at dawn, barely alive. He carried her to an improvised aid station set up in one of the few buildings still standing, a concrete bank that had survived the flames. Inside, hundreds of injured people lay on the floor, moaning, crying, calling for water that no one had. Doctors and nurses moved through the carnage, doing what they could with almost no supplies. Most treatment consisted of simply identifying who might live and who would die. Kimiko opened her eyes once. Through the haze of pain and smoke, she tried to speak. "Yuki, my daughter." The nurse beside her, a young woman whose own family was missing, held her hand and lied. "She's safe. She's in another shelter. Rest now." Kimiko closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. She would survive, barely, but she would never see Yuki again. Her daughter's body was never identified, lost among the tens of thousands who simply vanished that night. Part 4. The Morning After. Tokyo, 8 a.m., March 10, 1945. Dawn broke over Tokyo like a revelation of hell. The firestorm had burned itself out around 5 in the morning, having consumed everything flammable within its reach. What remained was a landscape that defied comprehension. 16 square miles of ash and twisted metal, still smoking, still radiating heat like a vast charcoal pit. From the air, reconnaissance planes photographed the damage. The pilots, hardened veterans who had seen devastation in Europe and across the Pacific, stared in silence at their cameras' images. Entire neighborhoods had simply ceased to exist. Where there had been houses, shops, temples, schools, where hundreds of thousands of people had lived their lives, there was now nothing but gray powder and charcoal fragments. The Sumida River, once a scenic waterway lined with cherry trees, had become a graveyard. Bodies floated in the water or lay piled on the banks, so many that accurate counting proved impossible. The heat had been so intense that many corpses had been reduced to skeletal remains or ash. Families would never know what happened to their loved ones. Major Yoshida, the officer who had worried about American industrial capacity back in 1943, walked through the devastation in his singed uniform. He had been at military headquarters on the outskirts when the raid began, watching the sky turn red, knowing what it meant, but helpless to stop it. Now, picking his way through the ashes, he found a child's toy, a wooden top, miraculously unburned, lying in the gray powder. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and felt something break inside him. All his warnings, all his careful analysis, and still no one believed until it was too late. "Sir," one of his aides approached, face pale, "the casualty estimates." "Tell me," Yoshida said flatly. "Over 100,000 dead, sir, possibly more. And 1 million homeless, maybe more." Yoshida nodded slowly. He'd expected as much. The numbers were staggering, but numbers couldn't capture what he was seeing. An entire city gone. A population traumatized beyond recovery. The myth of Japan's invincibility burned away with everything else.
Saipan, 8 a.m. The first bombers began returning to Isley Field. The crews staggered out, eyes red from fatigue and smoke. Some aircraft came back riddled with holes from anti-aircraft fire. Others never returned at all. Nearly 14 B-29s were lost that night. But among those who did, there was no cheer, no celebration. Captain Phillips's crew emerged from Shady Lady in silence. They've been in the air for over 12 hours, 6 hours to target, 2 hours over Tokyo, 5 hours back. They were exhausted, hungry, and haunted. Private Johnny Rossi, the young crew member who justified the mission by thinking of his uncle, sat on the tarmac and vomited. He couldn't get the smell out of his nostrils, the sickly sweet smell of burning that had permeated the aircraft even at 5,000 feet. "It's done," Captain Phillips said to his crew, his voice hoarse. "Get some food, get some sleep. Don't talk about it if you don't want to." They dispersed slowly, each man lost in his own thoughts. Sergeant Thomas Mitchell found a quiet spot near the flight line and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He had volunteered for this war after Pearl Harbor, angry and ready to fight. He'd bombed Japanese positions in the Philippines, had strafed enemy convoys, had done his duty without question. But last night had been different. Last night hadn't felt like combat. It had felt like murder. He didn't know that many of the men in his squadron felt the same way, that some would have nightmares for the rest of their lives, that the psychiatrists would call it operational fatigue, but everyone else would eventually call it PTSD. He just knew that something inside him had changed, something that could never be unchanged. LeMay's office, 9 a.m. General LeMay stood on the tarmac as the men disembarked. His orders had been followed to perfection. The mission, he knew, had done more damage in one night than months of precision bombing ever could. But there was no satisfaction in his expression, only exhaustion. An officer approached him with the first reconnaissance photographs from dawn. Tokyo, Japan's proud capital, had become a vast field of ash. Entire districts were erased from the map. 16 square miles. Over 100,000 civilians dead. 1 million more homeless. LeMay studied the photographs in silence. Other officers gathered around him waiting for his reaction. Some expected triumph. Others feared he might show regret. He did neither. "Send this to Arnold," he said, handing the photos back, "and tell the crews they'll have 72 hours of rest before the next mission." "The next mission, sir?" Major Power asked carefully. LeMay's eyes were cold, calculating. "Nagawa, then Osaka, then Kobe. Every major city in Japan. We're going to burn them all until they surrender." Power swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." LeMay lit a cigar and stared out at the Pacific. Years later, he would be asked if he felt guilt for what he'd done. His answer would be characteristically blunt. If we lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals. But that morning, standing on a coral airstrip thousands of miles from home, he allowed himself one moment of doubt, a fleeting thought about the line between military necessity and moral catastrophe, and whether he'd just crossed it. Then he crushed the thought like he crushed his cigar, and went back to work. If you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. Tokyo, noon, March 10, 1945. When the fires finally died, the city lay silent beneath the choking haze. The imperial palace had been spared, but only by luck in the shifting wind. The rest of Tokyo was gone. The scale of the disaster began to reveal itself as the sun climbed higher. Entire neighborhoods that had housed tens of thousands were reduced to ash so fine that winds scattered it like snow. The few concrete buildings that remained standing were hollow shells, their interiors consumed, their walls cracked from thermal stress. Fire crews from neighboring districts arrived to help, but there was nothing to do except dig through the rubble for bodies. The morgues were overwhelmed within hours. Emergency crematoriums were set up, but they couldn't process the dead fast enough. Bodies were stacked in parks, covered with sheets, waiting. In the Asakusa district, where the firestorm had burned hottest, workers found streets where the heat had been so intense that the asphalt had melted and human bodies had been fused into the molten pavement. In some places, only shadows remained, dark stains on walls where people had been standing when the flash of heat vaporized them. Dr. Seiji Imamura, a physician who had volunteered at the makeshift hospitals, worked for 36 hours straight treating burn victims. Most of what he did was simply offer morphine and comfort. The burns were too extensive, the resources too limited. He watched people die by the hundreds, knowing he could do nothing to save them. On his second night without sleep, as he knelt beside a dying child, he began to weep, not just for this child, but for all of them, for the futility of war, for the knowledge that this would happen again and again until Japan surrendered. And surrender seemed impossible to imagine for a culture built on the principle that defeat was worse than death. Imperial Palace, March 11, 1945. Emperor Hirohito, riding through the ruins the next day, sat speechless in his open car. For the first time, he saw his empire's heart reduced to rubble. The emperor's tour had been carefully planned by his advisors, who hoped the sight would strengthen his resolve to fight on. Instead, it had the opposite effect. He saw mothers clutching dead children. He saw old men digging through ashes with their bare hands. He saw survivors with burned faces and empty eyes, staring at him as his motorcade passed, not with reverence, but with something approaching accusation.
"Stop the car," he said quietly. His security detail stiffened. "Your Majesty, the schedule. Stop the car." The vehicle halted. Hirohito stepped out, accompanied by 2 guards, and walked toward a group of survivors huddled near a destroyed temple. They fell to their knees immediately. Even now, even after everything, the emperor was divine. "Please, stand," he said, his voice soft. "You need not bow." An old woman looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "my grandson, the fire." Hirohito felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The invasion of China, Pearl Harbor, the occupied territories, the refusal to consider peace, and now this, his own people burning in their homes while he remained safe behind palace walls. "I am deeply sorry,"
he said. The words felt inadequate, hollow, but they were all he had. He returned to his car in silence. His advisors tried to speak to him, but he raised a hand for quiet. For the rest of the tour, he stared out the window at the devastation, saying nothing. That night, in his private chambers, Hirohito spoke to his most trusted advisor, Marquis Koichi Kido. "How long can our people endure this?" Kido hesitated. "Your Majesty, the military insists we can fight on for years. They speak of a decisive battle on the home islands. I asked how long our people can endure, not what the generals think." Kido met his emperor's eyes. "Not long, Your Majesty. Perhaps weeks. Perhaps days." Hirohito nodded slowly. Seeds of doubt had been planted, seeds that would eventually grow into the unprecedented decision to accept surrender. But that decision lay months in the future. For now, the war would continue. Military Headquarters, March 12, 1945. Even the military headquarters that once laughed off American propaganda was now a blackened shell. General Sugiyama, the same man who had mocked the B-29 reports 2 years earlier, stood before his staff and whispered, "So this is their impractical machine." But even now, surrender was unthinkable. The military code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, demanded death before dishonor. Japanese soldiers were trained from childhood that capture was shameful, surrender was cowardice, and the only honorable end was death in battle. This philosophy had led to suicidal banzai charges, kamikaze attacks, and the mass civilian deaths at Saipan. Now it would lead to a decision that stunned the military leadership. Japan would prepare for Kitsugo, the decisive operation, a final apocalyptic defense of the home islands that would arm every man, woman, and child capable of holding a weapon. They would turn Japan into a battlefield. They would fight to the last person. They would make the Americans pay in blood for every inch of sacred soil. Major Yoshida, listening to his superiors plan this madness, felt despair settled over him like ash. They had learned nothing. Even with Tokyo in ruins, with hundreds of thousands dead, with American bombers operating freely in their skies, even then they could not admit defeat. "Excuse me," he said quietly, standing and walking out of the meeting. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. Outside, he looked up at the sky, clear and blue and innocent. Somewhere up there, more B-29s were preparing for their next mission. More Japanese cities would burn. More people would die. And still, Japan would fight on. The myth of Japanese invincibility burned with the city. In the War Department, the news spread quickly. Operation Meeting House had exceeded every expectation. Analysts calculated that the tonnage of bombs dropped, 1,665 tons of incendiaries, had inflicted more damage than the atomic bomb would later cause in Hiroshima. But among some officers, there was unease. Colonel Henry Sweeney, who reviewed the mission data, sat in his Pentagon office staring at the reconnaissance photographs. The numbers were clinical, precise. 16 square miles destroyed, 267,171 buildings burned, estimated 100,000 dead. But the photos showed something numbers couldn't capture: the utter erasure of human habitation. He wrote in his notes, "If this is victory, it feels hollow. The line between soldier and civilian no longer exists." His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his door. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell entered, the man LeMay had replaced as commander of the 21st Bomber Command. "You've seen the results?" Hansell asked, his voice tight. "I have," Sweeney replied. "It's effective." Hansell sat heavily. He looked exhausted, older than his 41 years. "That was supposed to be my command, my strategy. High-altitude precision bombing of military and industrial targets, minimize civilian casualties, fight the war with some measure of honor." "The precision bombing wasn't working," Sweeney said carefully. "I know," Hansell snapped, then collected himself. "I know it wasn't. The weather, the jet streams, the dispersed industry, I know all the reasons. But there's a difference between not working and this." He pointed at the photographs. "We burned alive 100,000 people in a single night. That's more than died in the bombing of Dresden, more than died in Hamburg. In one night we killed more civilians than in any raid in history." "It will shorten the war," Sweeney offered. "Will it?" Hansell stood and paced. "Or will it stiffen Japanese resolve, make them fight harder because they know we'll exterminate them if they lose? Christ, Henry, we're the ones who are supposed to be the good guys. We're fighting against Japanese atrocities, Nazi genocide, and now we're burning entire cities full of civilians?" Sweeney had no answer. The same questions haunted him. "General Marshall is calling it a military success," Hansell continued bitterly. "Secretary Stimson is saying it's necessary to save American lives. And maybe they're right. Maybe this is what total war looks like now. But when this is all over, when historians write about what we did—" He trailed off, staring out the window at the Washington Monument gleaming in the distance. "We'll be judged," Sweeney finished quietly. "Yes," Hansell said, "we will." The White House, March 14, 1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the report on Operation Meeting House with mixed feelings. He was dying, though few knew it, his body ravaged by polio, high blood pressure, and the strain of leading the nation through years of war. He had weeks to live, though he didn't know that either. Secretary of War Henry Stimson sat across from him in the Oval Office, along with General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army. 100,000 in a single night, Roosevelt said slowly, his voice weak. "That's more than we lost in the entire Italian campaign." "Yes, Mr. President," Marshall replied. "It's also more than we estimated would die in a week of conventional invasion of the home islands." Roosevelt was silent for a moment. He had approved the B-29 program, had pushed for its development, had demanded results. Now, confronted with those results, he felt the weight of them. "Henry, tell me honestly," he asked Stimson, "are we crossing a line here?" Stimson, a principled man who had served in government for decades, chose his words carefully. "Mr. President, the Japanese refused to surrender after Saipan. They refused after Manila. They're preparing their civilian population for suicidal resistance. If we invade the home islands conventionally, estimates put total casualties, American and Japanese, at over 10 million. Against that calculus, burning Tokyo seems reasonable," Roosevelt finished. "I understand the mathematics, Henry. I'm asking about the morality." Marshall spoke up. "Sir, the Japanese burned most of China. They massacred civilians in Nanking. They tortured and murdered prisoners of war. They forced Korean women into sexual slavery. They conducted biological warfare experiments on prisoners. With respect, Mr. President, we didn't start this war, and we didn't set the rules. They did." Roosevelt nodded slowly. "Continue the bombing campaign. But I want it understood, clearly understood at every level of command, that we are targeting Japan's ability to wage war. The goal is to end this conflict as quickly as possible, not to commit genocide." "Yes, sir," both men replied. After they left, Roosevelt sat alone in his office for a long time. Outside, cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom around the tidal basin. Spring was coming, perhaps, finally, the end of the war. But at what cost? He didn't have an answer. And in less than a month, he would be dead, the burden of that question passing to Harry Truman, a man who would make even harder choices. Curtis LeMay's philosophy. Curtis LeMay brushed such doubts aside. "War isn't moral," he said bluntly when a reporter later asked about civilian casualties. "You win by making the other side quit." To LeMay, the equation was simple. Every day the war continued, American soldiers died. Japanese soldiers died. Chinese civilians died under occupation. Allied prisoners of war starved in camps. The fastest way to end the war was the most moral way, regardless of the methods used. He never lost sleep over Tokyo, never expressed regret. Years later, as Chief of Staff of the Air Force during the Cold War, he would advocate for nuclear first strikes on the Soviet Union if necessary, the same cold calculation applied to a new enemy. Some called him a war criminal, others called him a realist. He called himself a professional soldier doing what professionals do, winning wars at the lowest cost to his own side. But among his own crews, there were whispers, stories of men who couldn't forget what they'd seen, of pilots who woke screaming from nightmares, of bombardiers who quit the service as soon as the war ended and never spoke of it again. War changes everyone, even the winners.